Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. Today's book club episode is brought to us by Brazos Press, and we have a repeat guest today, Dr. Jessica Hooten Wilson. She's on our show today talking about her new book, Flannery O'Connor's Why Do the Heathen Rage? A behind the scenes look at a work in progress. It's unfinished novel in print for the first time. And we're excited to talk about this. And for a live audience, she's introducing who a recognizable name Flannery O'Connor is. Some other people might know a little bit more about her, but I guarantee that she's going to educate all of us more than we already know about Flannery O'Connor. So it's such an important person in history, and just thank Jessica for bringing her back out in the open. We have an endorsement for this book we've had on before, Esau McCauley. If you guys remember his episode with us on a book club episode, he's a Wheaton College author of How Far to the Promised Land episode. So I'll read his endorsement. This book is part detective story, part examination of O'Connor in the context of a changing America, especially racially, and part exploration of one of America's great writers in the process of creation. A great endorsement. So if you guys go to our show notes, there's a link to Brazos Press. Click that. It'll take you actually right to this book so you can easy click and order. And then just reminders of how to find our show on the internet. You can email us. You can find us on social media, Twitter and Instagram. You can also watch these episodes on YouTube. We have a growing YouTube audience. Subscribe to us there. You can watch our book club and seasonal episodes. And then just other information. If you aren't going to a church and not a member of a church, we would love to encourage everyone to do that. Find a creedal Christian church to call home. If you want to look for one specifically that's Reformed, there is a NAPARC link. It's a local church finder, and it'll take you to one of the Reformed denominations to check out. So, let's jump into this. I'll let Peter further introduce our repeat friend and guest today, Jessica Hooten Wilson.
Yeah, we have Dr. Jessica Hooten Wilson, who's the inaugural visiting scholar of liberal arts at Pepperdine University in Malibu, California, and we'll talk about that a little bit in this episode as well. Previously taught at the University of Dallas, she's an author or editor of 8 books, including Reading for the Love of God, which is the last book we had her on for, The Scandal of Holiness, which won the Christianity Today 2023 Award of Merit, and Giving the Devil His Due, Demonic Authority in the Fiction of Flannery O'Connor, who shows up obviously in this book, and Fyodor Dostoevsky, winner of 2018 Christianity Today Book of the Year Award. Hooten Wilson speaks around the world in topics as varied as Russian novelists, Catholic thinkers, and Christian ways of reading. So it's a pleasure having you back on the show again after, I think, just a few months or 6 months, 7 months, whatever it was. So thanks for coming back on, Dr. Hooten Wilson.
Absolutely. I appreciate the repeat invite.
Of course. Yeah. I saw Flannery O'Connor and I saw Jessica Hooten Wilson. I was like, what better combination than both of those things?
Oh, thanks.
So,
Thanks.
icebreaker question. We like asking
Mhm.
kind of, it's usually off the wall questions that the author doesn't know that we know. But this one, like, it's December 4th when we're recording this, and I can't not ask it. We're beginning of the Advent season. So, what are there any like fun Christian or Christmas traditions in the Hooten Wilson household? They're like, we just got to
Oh.
get this done this time of year.
Oh, man, you're catching me on a crazy year because we're in the midst of moving,
This
so
is
we're
true.
living in
So we'll
2
say like
places
on
at
a
the same
on
time.
a on a
Yeah.
non-move year, what's like a Hooten Wilson tradition?
We usually try to find a new book for Advent that we're
Okay.
gonna read all the way through,
Hmm.
and so last year we read J.R.R. Tolkien's letters to his son.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And we read the Christmas letters, so they began just to one son, and then over the time, he ended up writing them to his daughter by the end because he had, 4 kids all separated by years, and the
Yeah.
older ones, I think, thought it was less cool by the time we got to the youngest.
Yeah.
Um,
You're like,
this
this is
year, I don't
freaking
know.
J.R.R. Tolkien. This is amazing stuff.
Yeah, it was good. So I don't know what we'll you bringing that up makes me very aware that we have to pick a book right now. But it's
no
a weird
pressure. You're
season.
moving. Yeah, no pressure.
So, but yeah, no, it's a good reminder because we enjoy doing that as a family. We're in the middle of the Wing Feather Saga right now, and that is not
Oh,
Christmas.
I've
So we
heard
need to
so much
probably,
stuff about this. Yeah.
it's so fun.
Okay.
It's so fun. But I might have to convince my kids to pause and remember the Christian
Sure.
year and remember our tradition. But that's what we usually do.
Okay. Your tradition is so much cooler than ours. And we started this 5 or 6 years ago. I'm an Office fanatic, like the Office show fanatic. And our tradition, listeners, this is not as cool as reading J.R. Tolkien or anything like that, is going through all the Office Christmas episodes. That's like my thing. It's not as cool. It's not literary. It's not very Christian, but it's just what I do.
I actually do that for Thanksgiving for Friends. I love watching the Friends episodes for Thanksgiving. Those are my favorite Friends episodes, is the Thanksgiving ones.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So like for whatever reason, the Office Christmas episodes just like give me the mood. Yeah. So yep. So beyond your bio, beyond all this literary stuff, let our listeners know a little bit more about the woman, Jessica Hooten Wilson.
Yeah.
I know it's a big
question. So that's a huge question.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say like the defining things in my life is number one, family. I do a lot of speaking and traveling. And what I constantly underline for people is if you can bring my family, I'll probably say yes. If my family can join me, because I want them to see the world that I'm seeing. I want them to be part of the memories I'm making. As much as I love going to speak at churches and at schools and so forth, like I always want them to be part of it. So I've got 4 children. I just had my 4th 5 months ago.
That's right. I think you were pregnant with your 4th the last time we had
really?
you on. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've had my 4th, Junia, Magdalene.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Yeah. And so I spend a lot of time with my family, very involved. Actually, that's why it's one of the reasons we're going to Pepperdine, because I will be the only one working and we're going full time there. So, to take on a role as Fletcher Jones Chair of Great Books there on campus and get to teach again. And
that's right.
Yeah.
Is that a new chair, or is that like, did they make this for you, or has that been established before?
It's been established before. Yeah, I think we talked last time because I was at University of Dallas in a chair they made for me during that time. Yeah, so this one goes back. My first Great Books teacher when I was at Pepperdine, because it's my alma mater, was the first Fletcher Jones chair that they had.
Okay.
And it was crazy because he also went on to be a president of a university, and he wrote me a letter that I just got in the mail last week and said, I took a picture of my first class teaching at Pepperdine and you're in it. In the year 2000. He's like, I had it on my desk all the way through my presidency. And so he wrote me like, congratulations on picking up the chair after I taught you 20 something years ago. So it's cool.
A lot of exciting stuff going on for you. I mean, you're right when you're going to moving to Pepperdine, this book is coming out too. And your daughter's 5 months old.
Yeah, this is a lot of stuff.
That's cool. Congratulations times 3 on all this stuff.
That's right. I'm sure and this stuff.
This book has been probably, I don't know how to put it, gestating longer.
Oh, yeah. That's right.
Longer than
the
9
womb
months.
For a lot longer. They got birthed after a long gestation period.
Yeah. That's good.
So long time coming for this book.
There you go. Well, yeah. Talking about this book, you got into Flannery O'Connor and her writing early on in your life. And there's I think there's a story with you and a professor talking about your writing and then her writing. Her writing seemingly aided your own. So can you talk to us a little bit about your introduction to Flannery, and Nick will have a more kind of pointed question about Flannery. But how did you get introduced to Flannery O'Connor, and then how did you come to editing this book on Flannery O'Connor's Why Do They Heathens Rage?
Yeah, so one of the stories that I tell in the book in probably more details, I wanted to be a writer, and I also was a strong Christian. And when I was younger, my dad didn't understand all the dark things I was writing. I was writing a lot of fiction that was really dark. And he said, you need to write light. Like we believe in a God of hope. And what that was doing to my work was sanitizing everything. It's like I was unable to write about Good Friday. And I only knew how to write in a world of resurrection. And this professor that I met at Rhodes College, he gave me a Flannery O'Connor story to hopefully kind of turn the tide on the way that I was looking at it. And I loved it. It was The Life You Save May Be Your Own. It was so dark. It was so dark.
I just read it 2 weeks ago. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is not what I expected that to end like.
I know, like a tornado is coming after him at the end, like the rottenness of the world is coming to eat him alive that he himself is part of. But at the same time, there was something so hopeful about that. You know, one of the things I think people misunderstand about O'Connor, but that I got at 15 was she says somewhere that, you know, like Wyndham Lewis, who writes about the rot in the hill, it's not because you like rot. It's because you
Mhm,
like the hill
mhm.
and you don't want the rot to be there.
Yep, yep,
Mhm.
And I just perceived that right away in O'Connor's work. I understood then how to write about darkness without looking like I loved the darkness,
totally. Yep,
but
Mm.
actually because I loved the light.
Great
yep,
perspective. Yeah.
yep. But
Yeah.
yeah, you don't want to,
So,
like you said, you don't want to sanitize the darkness because then the light just doesn't become as luminous as it could be without the dark.
yes, yes, that's
Yeah.
exactly right. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool.
So, yeah, well said, Peter. But that's what I was trying to go for as I was learning Flannery and wanting to imitate her.
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
then before Nick asked this question, how did you come to editing this book, which is technically unfinished?
Yeah, that was Billy Sessions, and I dedicate the book to him and to Ralph Wood. So Ralph Wood was my dissertation director, called the dean of O'Connor studies sometimes jokingly. And he directed my dissertation. We went over to Italy. It was the first international Flannery O'Connor conference where
Yeah.
we both presented. And I had known a little Italian and had some familiarity with the area from living abroad. And so I ended up being like the graduate student tour guide of the group of keynotes. And we all went out to dinner.
Oh,
And
yeah.
among them was Billy Sessions. And Billy Sessions started telling me about Flannery's unfinished novel, which I had never heard of
Mhm.
before. So that started a whole trek to the archives, which I write about. And the estate was just very eager to kind of get out a lot of her work. So during the time I've been working on this, they've also released her prayer journal.
Hmm.
They've released her juvenilia, the things that she was writing when she was in high school. So there's just been this kind of concerted effort over the last decade or so to put more and more of her unfinished things out there in people's hands. I mean, if you look at her posthumous work, most of her stuff was published after she died because she didn't
Hmm.
get to live very long.
No, she was what,
And
39,
so
38 when she died?
39, yeah.
Yeah.
So so most of what we know about her is from her like her posthumous work.
Oh, okay.
Sure.
Interesting.
Yeah. And her name, Flannery O'Connor's, fairly recognizable, generally speaking. If you said her name, like most people are like, yeah, I think I've heard that name before. But most
Yeah.
people, even including myself before this book, if you're like, all right, well, who is she? What's about her? I'd be like, I need help. I don't know how to describe who she was, unfortunately. But it's thank you again for bringing her back out because she's so important. We can learn a lot from her. She's an important historical figure in recent history. But yeah, this opens up the door for you to do her the honor of explaining her bio to the world. Again, she's not living right now, so it's to the audience that doesn't know who she is, maybe only knows her name and nothing else. Please just kind of give a bio of Flannery
Yeah.
O'Connor.
You know, for a country who says that it's a really Christian country and there's a lot of Christians, if you think about all of our great writers, which ones are like the strong Christian, like devotedly Orthodox Christian writers that we have in our history? And it's very hard to come by some names.
Yeah.
Flannery is one that you can point to. And
Mhm.
I mean, she has a stamp made of her. I mean, this is someone who is recognized as a renowned writer of
Yep.
genius, and yet, you know, in our church is also a big figure. She was devout. She was Catholic, but she always joked about being like if she was going to be Protestant, she'd be Pentecostal because she was just very much a believer in the reality of the Holy Spirit. She was someone who thought the incarnation was the main point of her life
Hmm.
and it was the main point of her work. Like I would even say this pun intended, like the crux of her work. So for Flannery, she took the claims of the scriptures to be the truth on which she rested not only her life but her work. And in the Protestant South, she's telling the story mostly through Protestant eyes
Hmm.
because that's the majority of that's what are around her.
Hmm.
She was a Georgia writer. She does not come from like a aristocratic family like Walker Percy, another Southern writer. She instead is more in the rural, and her family were constantly depending on her relatives for support.
Hmm.
So she grew up on a farm that wasn't even actually owned by them. That her uncle gave them because her father had passed away. And so you just have to see her not in the sense of like white gentility, like some false idea
Ah,
of like the white privilege. That's not the world that she lived in and resided in. Instead, she's on a farm. She said, the only thing I know about the land is it's underneath me. So she wasn't a farmer, but
yeah.
she would sit and she would write every single day. And when she was diagnosed with lupus, it did not become a moment of despair for her, but
Hmm.
almost gave her a limitation of time. We're all dying, but she knew that her time was much shorter, and so she dedicated that to her work and making sure that she used her talents that God gave her during the time she had.
Mm,
Yeah.
very nice.
Yeah. So getting more into this book, or rather kind of unfinished book,
Hmm.
what's it like? Maybe tell our listeners, who, people maybe used to edited books of maybe a bunch of editors and they're doing something together and finishing off a work. But this is an editing work of an unfinished book with
Mhm.
manuscripts everywhere. So
Hmm.
what's it like editing this and then seeing, as this was an unfinished at the time of Flannery, like what was that like, editing this
Yeah.
work, compiling it all together, all the marginalia, all the kind of other explanations? What's that like?
Hmm. Yeah, I have to give credit to Harrison Scott Key, and if you don't know his works, you have to go look him up. He's one of my favorite writers, also become a friend over the last decade or so. And he and I were talking about this in the early stages when I was just getting started with this project. Like, how do I do this? There's 378 pages.
Yeah.
There's just like all over the map. Like it's episodic and
Yeah.
the novel's not really there, but what's there is so good. How do I get people to read it? And he's like, what is most interesting is the story behind the story.
Ah.
And that just kind of stuck with me. Like, how do I tell the story behind the story? Because the
Mm.
story itself, right? The fiction is not finished,
Mm-hmm.
but Flannery has died. So there has to be a full story somewhere in this material. And so that's what I did is I kind of went through and it's just very experimental. Like I was able to protect her work so you can see the pieces that she left there. But I also had to make decisions because the scenes themselves still aren't finished. They have her handwriting on them. They have 5 or 6 different versions of every scene. You have different names for the characters throughout the process. So there were a lot of editorial decisions. I did not try to do it by myself. I was regularly writing people in the scholarly community. I was regularly writing writers and asking writers, like, do you see how this works? Does this fit? So I don't claim to have done this all alone. I was
Totally.
constantly in dialogue with friends trying to get this material right and to do it well.
You
Yeah.
kind of had to enter her head in a way.
Yeah. You've been in it for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I've been reading her since I was 15.
Yep.
Mhm.
And so the writer that I know better than any other writer. And my family's actually so my parents both met in Warner Robins, which is about an hour or so from Milledgeville. So I'm kind of from that area
Okay.
Mm.
actually. So it's like I know her world really well. I know her work backwards and forwards. I can tell you where things are from. I know her lines. I've read her biography so many times and can put her letters, in order on her biography.
Hmm.
And so I lived in her world for so many years, even more than just the 10 years I worked on this project. So,
Mm.
Sure. Yeah. Before next question, maybe this is not an aside, but kind of an addendum to my last question.
mhm,
Because it's not just editing all this stuff and kind of presenting it in a book form, but you
mhm.
have like editorial comments. There's like little snippets of chapters that you have after stuff or introducing stuff. Maybe like what are you trying to do in those things and help the reader
Sure.
along with reading this short story?
You know, separate from this, but I am gonna it's gonna tie all the
Do
way
it.
around. So the last book I wrote was Reading for the Love of God.
Yep.
And one of the things that I found is that people have this assumption that you don't need help reading the Bible, right? And
Yeah.
and yet, like to even get the Bible in your hands, like you have to, like a lot of people had to read it and
Yeah.
translate it and give you editorial, like they had to make editorial decisions, but they're unseen when you receive the Bible. So one of the things that I've done is I'm showing you what normally goes unseen in the process.
Okay.
That's kind of
Mm.
what I felt like I was doing, is that reading is not a solo activity, but it's actually more of a communal one, just like writing is not a solo activity, it's a communal one. And it's based on we don't even see most of the things it's based on. It's based on our history. It's based on our biography. It's based on our current moment. It's based on the headlines, the things we're reading. And all of that goes into the writing process, whether you can draw line by line, which, what does it allude to and how did this character come to be? And so what I've done instead is I've kind of turned the skin inside out and shown you the skeleton and shown you how all the pieces work together more than you usually get in a book. And so for writers, I feel like it's a really helpful book to be able to see that. It's more like exoskeleton, right?
Sure.
In the way that I've put the book together.
This is a purely hypothetical question, but I'm curious. Yeah. If the book were finished, do you think you would have done something different?
Oh, I did finish it. That's so, yeah. I mean, like this is 10 years coming. So this is my third version of doing it this way.
Or if Flannery, if Flannery had finished her work, do you think your editing work would have been different?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. If she had actually finished the work, I don't know if you ever read 3 Days Before the Shooting, the Ralph Ellison book, or the Hemingway one that was finished by Michael Peach.
Yeah, I know which one you're talking. Yes.
Okay. Yep. Yeah, or like Sanditon, people finish Jane Austen all the time.
Yep.
And so you don't really have to show the editorial process in that.
Gotcha.
But if I was going to both protect her work and have a completed story, then I had to go ahead and do it the way that I did it. I think that's the only way to be able to still feel like you're reading a story.
Cool. Gotcha. Makes sense.
Okay. So, yeah, that was helpful. Peter's question was the editorial background and structure going into this. Mine is, what's the story all about? Can you give a 30,000 foot view of this story? Some of the main characters, what's the plot? What's the drama? Is there a resolution? All that stuff that makes up a story. So what's going on? What's the story?
People are like, unfinished. Does this have a resolution? Like, am I going to feel good at the end of the story? Or it's going to be like horrible murders and other stories of.
And what part did you pick up where she left off that you kind of finished,
Yeah. I would say there's two different stories taking place on the different levels. So there's the work that Flannery began, which is the coolest start of a story. And I hope it just starts a bunch of fan fiction, right? Like, she was trying to understand human relationships.
Yep.
She's dealing with gender and she's dealing with race and she's dealing with region.
It's not the story I expected, but it's the story we got.
No, right. So it's, a lot of people accused her for a long time of not centering race in her work. Yeah. And in this one she does. So she, kind of takes the bulls by the horns. So she starts with Walter, allusion to like Walter the Penniless or, Walter Hilton or something like that. She takes this figure who is an intellectual in the South, who is white, who's living on a plantation very similar to her own. And he decides to write letters to people. And what he's doing is actually kind of being a troll, like we would see on like Twitter or something.
His letters are hilarious. Yeah.
He's writing all these letters pretending to be different people and attacking people. But he starts having a correspondence with a woman named Una Gibbs, who's in New York, who believes in not only the civil rights movement, but in a larger sense of like, I'm going to love all people all the time. And like, I've broken through the ceiling of religion and I am free now to love everybody. Very 1960s kind of embrace of love and that way of defining it. So he wants to test her faith in this new religion she's come up with by posing as a Black man and making love to her through the mail. And really challenges her, like, you would never actually love me if you were here and met me face to face. And of course, now she's coming.
Yep.
And that's really right? Like, that's the start of the novel. So what we get to see behind the scenes is Flannery trying to figure out more where she was going to go with this. She starts writing their past. She starts trying to create who they were as children. And so she has all of this other material that goes along with it. But the plot doesn't really go beyond those moments.
No.
That's what we get to see.
Yeah. The ending's like kind of funny. He's like, oh, I'm sick and I have these diseases. Don't come and see me.
Right. He's like, stop. Which we wouldn't have wanted to happen.
Like, oh, okay.
Yeah. We want to see like what they have to meet. Something has to happen. Like, are they going to fall in love? Is one of them going to murder the other one? Like, there has to be something.
When she sees that he's not Black, what's she going to do with him? Yeah.
Yes. And so then I'm telling the second story, which is why did she write this? And as readers, then what do we do? So I'm kind of telling our story of like, what do we do with this material and why that matters, right? And I think why she was starting to write it gives us the impetus to continue these same conversations now that she
Mm.
only got started with.
What's the lesson we learned from her writing?
Yeah, I think that we're all in process.
Mhm.
It's so funny to me how people have been canceling writers when they discover sin. And it's like, what was there something in which people assumed writers weren't sinners? Like they had
Exactly.
like a different
Yeah. Yeah.
ontology than the rest of us? Like, where did we get this idea that writers have to write without sin and without ever saying anything stupid? And so I'm kind of exposing that, like, no, all writers are in process, but guess what? That's just showing what readers are. Readers are all in process. So there's then become a responsibility for a reader as much as there is for a writer to be telling that in process story, to not assume that we have finished symphonies on this side of life.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
That beautifully tees up this question, and it's because I wrote it, which is why it really tees up this question. But I'm slightly changing the order because I think this makes more sense here. But you wrote about an incident at Loyola. I don't remember if you named the university or not, but I looked it up just to see some of the more resources where O'Connor is canceled, just exactly like you said. Her name is taken off, I think, a dorm or something like that.
Yeah.
Because students assumed from a flawed source, being I think their teacher, that she was a racist. And you talk about this a little bit at length. But the real story is a lot more complex because of her writing style, her voice, and her use of sarcasm and projection. So can you help us out? Like, how does she write about this stuff, and how does it come across maybe incorrectly for those who aren't used to Flannery's writing style?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's hard to explain in the amount of time that we have. But yes, she says racist things. Like that's a given. I don't think we should apologize for that. Like that's horrible that she did it. We
I
can't
think you
excuse
spend
the
some time in the
behavior.
book talking about the N-word. Like, should I actually say the N-word because she says it?
Right. So there's no getting around that part. I think what's more complex is one, where she was as a person, her heart, in her process, in her pilgrimage. She did not agree with racism, and she writes against racism, and her story actually transcends her own personal biography when it comes to what she was writing and how she was trying to show. And I think this is brilliant. And I didn't learn this until I was like in my 20s and 30s. She's trying to show that race is an artificial construct. Like that, I missed that until Willie James Jennings like pointed out in The Christian Imagination. Like I missed that race is an artificial construct. And here she is writing about that in the 50s and saying like we have to pass down racism for racism to keep existing. Like children are not born hating the person next to them.
At the
right?
height of Southern racism, she's writing about some of this stuff.
Yes. And I think that's what's profound. And so to completely erase that because she doesn't fit in 2023, or I guess this was 2020 when she was accused, because it doesn't fit 2020's idea of how we're supposed to treat one another, like that becomes a problem. Because I don't think the Flannery of 2020 would have looked like the Flannery of 1964. And I think that if she would have been allowed the time to be where we are.
So yeah, Flannery O'Connor, this Catholic author, is not particularly known for heartwarming stories. And like we talked about pre-recording, I read a collection of her short stories, kind of coincidentally, providentially, in the midst of reading your editor work of her stuff. And the first story in this short story was ended with a grandma getting shot in the chest. And then the story ends. And you're like, oh my gosh, this is not what I expected her writing to be like. But it peers in the depths of human depravity with no happy ending. And so can you maybe show us or describe, are there parallels in Why Did the Heathen Rage with her other work? Does she pull from other stories? Maybe similarities in characters? You kind of talked about this a little bit. And what might there be different in this from her other work as well?
Yeah. So J.F. Powers, who was a novelist writing at the same time as Flannery O'Connor, he said, you've got to get out of this habit of killing off your characters. And this was 1960, and she actually listened. And so if you look after 1960, she's really not killing off her characters. More and more, she's keeping them alive. So Everything Rises Must Converge. Yes, someone is like maybe dying of a stroke, but it's not the same kind of ending. Julian is still alive and living to see, the next day in this world of guilt and sorrow. You have Parker's Back. right? You have Revelation, of course,
Mhm.
is probably the most obvious example.
Mhm.
But you have more and more characters are living, and she's also responding to a world. She now has a television, and television became more
Uh,
graphic and more in your face and more violent
huh.
in her living room, and that was changing the way that she was writing. So she is kind of having a departure from her early 1950s work in which everybody is getting shot or maimed or blinded or gored, etc. And she
Yeah.
wrote that way because she's wanting to shock the system. So she's doing the right thing. She's trying to scandalize in the right way.
Yeah.
And she's trying to scandalize them with the truth of the unseen things. So
Yep.
that the drama of the seen world has to be bright, really, for her readers, right? She said the famous line is that she drew large, startling figures for the near blind, or she shouted for the near
Mhm.
deaf. So she is trying to do that. But towards the end, she said, okay, now I've gotten to the point in my career where I have to imitate God's still small voice when he talks to Elijah.
Mm.
That's where I'm going. And so what we have in the Why Did Heathen Rage is she's trying for less shock and more of the still small voice. We also see a lot of, she was reading a lot of saints and so forth at the
Mm.
very end, reading a lot of like letters of Jerome and Augustine, and she quotes the letters of Jerome. So we know she was in the midst of reading it while she was writing this. So what I see in Why Did the Heathen Rage is her also maybe imitating the saints. And if I imagine what the ending would look like for me, I would take Walter and turn him into a holy fool. Like I would move him towards what would it look
Huh.
like after his conversion, and write a whole novel like that. I think that would be brilliant.
Yeah, because what she does well in other stories too is there's both like direct killing and direct like killing off of characters, but there's other
Hmm.
times where it's like kind of assumed in her writing, like this is what's
Hmm.
happening, but she doesn't actually tell you about it. But she talks about other things that make you think, oh, that actually did happen back then.
Yes.
But
Yes.
she's so good at like covering things and not telling you what happened, and your
Hmm.
mind like goes into different places. Like, well, this must have happened because why wouldn't it have happened?
Yeah. Yeah. She trusts the reader. And I think she gives a lot of grace to the reader that way.
Yeah, it's riveting. She like you were riveted. I was like, why haven't I read more of her before this? This is so good. So last question. What do you hope with the publishing of Why Did the Heathens Rage? What do you hope this adds to the Flannery canon?
Hmm.
Maybe is there other stuff kind of in the pipeline that you might know of, or is this the last work, or whatever questions may come of that? And then what are you hoping readers come away with after reading an unfinished story, which is different than what we're used to? And maybe the closest thing you can come to is like I think of like the ending of Mark, like the short ending of Mark is like
Hmm.
somewhat of an unfinished story, but it kind of like it leads to you longing for
Mm.
what's happening next. And maybe
Yeah.
what are your insights and editing work from this that you can share with your readers?
Yeah. You bring up Mark, but you could also say the same thing with Acts. And I think
True,
these are
true,
the
true.
biblical precedent is really good for this because a lot of times, especially when I was being raised in church, I was thinking along the lines of like the Bible is finished, like the stories of God's church are done,
Hmm.
right? They're wrapped up and there's Genesis, Revelation, like we have a full story. Whereas the reality is Acts doesn't really finish
No.
because we're still the acts of the church. We're still
Hmm.
in that act of God's drama. I think with Flannery, that's what she gives us. So she gives us the ability to still be in that act. And as artists and authors and writers, we don't have to only look to the past and be like, well, wasn't it great when C.S. Lewis wrote good stuff? And wasn't it great when Flannery
Hmm.
O'Connor wrote great books? In some sense, reading her unfinished work reminds us that yes, she was a genius, but she had a gift and she was faithful with that gift. And what can happen if we're faithful with our gifts? Right? She also, we see that it's not as perfect as her earlier work because she as a perfectionist didn't get the time with it that she could have. So we now as writers we don't have to be scared that genius just it has to pop out perfect and that's what you have. Instead it's like, no, you need to faithfully cultivate. You need to revise. You have to work at stuff. And when you do, what can God do with your talents? What can he give the world through your art and through your faithfulness? That's what I've received from Flannery, not just studying her complete works, which are genius, but also getting to see the letters, getting to see behind the scenes, getting to read Why Did the Heathen Rage and realize, like all of us, she was always just there's a story to tell. Let's tell it and let's see what God does with that.
Yeah. Well, like you were saying, beginning of this, I think there's some knee-jerk reaction from a lot of Christians when they read her story. As like you said, we tend to be used to like feel-good stories, or we want feel-good stories. We want the story to have a kind of a nice and neat ending, which is why like I'm convinced that the short ending of Mark and not the long ending of Mark is like that. Like long ending is kind of an easy, like, oh, it ends, versus the short ending is like, oh, like it leaves you with like this impulse for more. And I think sometimes as Christians, we're not like, we like the finish. We like the resolve of the story. And yeah, Flannery like doesn't scratch that itch for a lot of us. She makes us think, okay, what are you going to do next?
Yeah, but I think even the scriptures do that.
Yeah.
Our idea of the nice, tidy ending is just not biblical.
No, it's not.
So when we try to
it's
think
more
of the
Christian
creatures,
culture than biblical literature. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And so we're trying to think if we're supposed to be like Christ, he ends the gospels not by saying like, I'm resurrected, so everything's going to be wonderful now. I'm resurrected, so take up your cross. Like, this is where the journey leads.
Yeah.
Now it's your turn. And that's just not a tied up ending with a bow, right? There's so many things that can happen from that kind of go and make disciples ending. And so I think that Flannery's work always challenges us to go against cultural Christianity and more towards imitation of the incarnation.
Yeah, when I was thinking, with biblically speaking, I was thinking like how Second Kings ends. It's like a to be continued. It's very like abrupt and like, oh, well, what now? Like, and then
right at the end of the story, he's captured. Yep.
Yeah.
It's a cool to be continued, but it's like, well, what now? And then also like we're living in Acts 29 right now, like you said. There's Acts 28, and we're now. So good points biblically. Yeah.
No, well, thank you. Yeah, and maybe to kind of end this with our listeners, anything that you're working on, what are you looking forward to? What are you teaching at Pepperdine and all that good stuff?
So I'm going to be teaching great books, which is all the things that kind of influenced Flannery to get to be who she was, right?
So for the listener who's not informed, what are the great books? Because I think people are hearing about this more and more often, like classical education, great books. Like what is that?
Awesome. Well, it's the greatest things in human history that have ever been thought and said.
Oh, that's pretty good.
So
I want that.
Exactly.
That's a good.
Putting them all in conversation. So, we have this rich tradition where a lot of people would recognize a canon of, Homer and Virgil and so forth, which are phenomenal. And I always teach them. But I also love teaching some of the things that we're just now finding too. Marjorie Kemp, for example, wrote a book in the 1400s and we knew it existed. We found it in 1934. And now, is it part of the canon? Because it's this historical 14th century book that's just so good and so powerful. So I think the canon is just more fluid. It's dynamic. So when I talk about great books, I'm talking about just always what is the greatest that has been thought and said. And for me, that begins with scripture and then goes from there. So I'm teaching the Bible in concert with all of these other geniuses that came after the apostles, including Flannery. So that's what I'm teaching. I love it. I love getting to teach Dostoevsky and Dante and Augustine every year. It's such a gift. But on writing, I'm writing actually a lot about women right now. And I'm writing something that I hope is more fictional. I'm very excited about it. I'm imitating another 14th century writer. So Christine de Pizan. She wrote this book. Have you read that?
We had you're not going to know this name because he's too small, but Craig Troxel, who's an OPC minister, but he's a humongous like fiction, literary, and poetry reader. And so we read all of this stuff in his spirituality classes.
So cool. Okay, that is so cool. Yeah. So she wrote in 1400s about the Book of the City of Ladies, and basically like, what are women and what are they for, and who are all the great women throughout history and mythology that we just have never heard of and not uplifted. And it's a whole book on it. Well, it's written in the 1400s. There's a lot that's happened since then. And also we don't read allegorical narrative as much. Like ladies descending that are reason and rectitude and justice doesn't really make sense to us.
No.
So I instead am going to be Christine in my version right now. It's so much fun. And Dorothy L. Sayers, Edith Stein, and Anna Julia Cooper are descending to have conversations with me. And it is just,
those are some conversation partners right there.
Right. They're brilliant. And so I'm having a lot of fun getting to write a dialogue that's similar. Like, what are women? And then picking up with Christine where she left off. So
interesting. Yeah. Cool. Well, if people want to read the modern Christine de Pizan, then they can read Jessica Hooten Wilson whenever this comes out. This would be.
That's what I hope.
This would be super fun. Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you first so much for your work, for bringing the great
Thanks.
books back in conversation, for bringing Flannery O'Connor back in conversation, for Christians who should be reading them, for non-Christians, for whoever picks her up. I mean, she's a ridiculously gifted writer.
Yes, very
Who's
much.
just like Nick said, her name is known, but her work is not as well known. And hopefully this kicks back interest. And thanks for your time. And you will be moving into our neck of the woods pretty soon, not too far away from where I'll be. So this would be fun to have you in the area and see great books and classical Christianity kind of thrive in this area, hopefully. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your work. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, thank you guys.
Thank you.